Very nice to see you all. I'm Johanna Birtner. I'm a professor in government and politics and director of GVPT Global. I want to welcome you to the inaugural talk in the Ted Gurr lecture series. We are going to have some introductory remarks by Dr. Paul Huth, who is the director of the Center for International Development and Conflict Management, who is sponsoring this event. GVPT Global is co-sponsoring the event with the center. Dr. Huth is going to say some introductory remarks about Ted Gurr, whose lecture series this honors. So with that, can I introduce Dr. Huth?
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to see everyone here. It's a nice turnout. As Hannah mentioned, this is the first inaugural lecture in the Ted R. Gurr lecture series. As many of you might know, we were thinking of doing this about 3 years ago, and something happened in the world called the pandemic, and we had to put those plans on hold. So I can't tell you how happy I am and delighted to come back to this and to have the inaugural lecture actually come to fruition. I want to take a few minutes to talk about the legacy of Ted Gurr, just a renowned and distinguished scholar, political scientist, social scientist. Ted Gurr received his PhD in 1965 at New York University, and then went on and began a truly distinguished academic career in research and analysis. He taught at a number of universities, Princeton, Northwestern University for many years, and at University of Colorado at Boulder, and then, most importantly, he arrived here at the University of Maryland in 1989. And Ted Gurr was on the faculty at Government and Politics and a distinguished fellow in CIDCM until his retirement in 2001. And during that time, he was awarded the Distinguished University Professorship by the University of Maryland. That was in 1995. Ted Gurr had a prolific career as a researcher and writer. He produced more than 20 books and monographs over the course of his career, published over 100 academic articles and book chapters, and produced work of a lasting legacy. He researched a broad area, including crime, its causes, particularly political causes of crime, starting out in the United States and moving on to more comparative perspectives. More generally, he studied important issues about ethnic minorities, the discrimination they suffer, the state repression potentially they are at risk of, did enduring and very influential work in all of these areas. He published, as I mentioned, over 20 books. One of his most important books, published in 1970, is Why Men Rebel. A very, very landmark study, continues to be cited regularly. I'm an editor for a journal, and I can't tell you how many times that book continues to be cited by scholars studying conflict behavior and state repression and questions about the mistreatment of ethnic groups and human rights violations. In terms of his larger legacy, in terms of in addition to the publications that he produced, he also was involved in several database projects that have a continuing legacy. And one I made mention to briefly is the Minorities at Risk project that he conceived of in the 1980s and started to develop a systematic database in the 1990s. And that database, the Minorities at Risk database, is widely used by scholars studying ethnic conflict. My good colleague Hannah continues to work very hard on it, and maybe we'll say a few words about that. But the Minorities at Risk led to many publications and widespread use of the data set. Another legacy of Ted Gurr is that he was involved in the development of what's called the polity data set, which provides a very long time series, longitudinal comparison of the political institutions and characteristics of countries going back to the early 19th century and close to the present time. That also is another data set widely used by scholars in comparative research. I would also mention that he was involved in the State Failure Project in the 1990s and early 2000s, and out of that work, systematic data has been collected that he was involved in dealing with armed violence, overthrows of governments, instances of genocide and politicide that has been collected, and it's also used by scholars studying conflict behavior. Mr. Gurr, Professor Gurr, in my view, esteemed Professor Gurr, received many awards for his work over the years. Just a few examples of the awards included a Ford Foundation Fellowship, a Guggenheim Fellowship, German Marshall Fund Fellowship. He was a Peace Fellow at the U.S. Institute of Peace. And he received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Conflict Processes section at the American Political Science Association. And as I mentioned, he was a distinguished university professor here at the University of Maryland. I would also want to mention another great legacy of Professor Gurr was he was a mentor. And he worked very closely with graduate students. He served on over 40 dissertations as the chair. And he was also an excellent mentor to junior scholars. And so another legacy of Ted Gurr is the research and output produced by the students that he mentored. They've gone on to many excellent and productive careers in the profession. So in sum, I just want to conclude by saying that Ted Gurr leaves a legacy as truly a distinguished scholar, a great mentor, and in my view, an exemplary example of a social scientist who deeply cared about trying to improve the world with the understanding that rigorous social science, theory, data, measurement, and analysis was absolutely essential to providing solid evidence for making policy analysis and policy recommendations. So with that, I will give it back to Hannah, who will make the introduction for our guest speaker today.
So it is my great privilege and pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Dr. Christian Davenport. He is the Mary Ann and Charles Walgreen Professor of the Study of Human Understanding at the University of Michigan. He is also a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo and an elected fellow to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Dr. Davenport was a faculty member in the Department of Government and Politics and an affiliate of CIDCM from 1999 to 2008, and he was a close colleague of Ted Gurr's, who hand-selected him to run both the polity and the minorities at risk projects. And that's in fact how I first came to know Dr. Davenport when he introduced me to the Minorities at Risk project, which is an ongoing work to this day. Dr. Davenport is an internationally renowned scholar of domestic state repression, human rights violations, social movements, and political contention. He is the author of several books, most recently, The Death and Life of State Repression, published in 2022. He has also published The Peace Continuum, How Social Movements Die, and numerous articles that have appeared in all of the most distinguished journals in the profession. These include the American Political Science Review, the American Sociological Review, American Journal of Political Science, Journal of Politics, and I could go on and on. He has also been supported by all of the most prestigious funding agencies, some of which my colleague Dr. Huth mentioned already. Dr. Davenport is also, in my opinion, one of the most creative and engaging scholars that we have in the field today. He continually astounds and inspires me, and it is my great pleasure to hand the podium over and invite him to give the inaugural talk in this Ted Gurr annual lecture series.
That's a whole lot of niceness. Okay. Let me get set up. So it's interesting to be in a context where I was so comfortable in many respects. I loved my time here, so getting the invite to return is a dream of sorts. So thank you for that moment. All right, y'all. Okay, so I don't know what you thought you were going to hear, but we're going to have some fun. So this is, at a certain point, like we work on a bunch of different topics, and then you're invited to go do something, and you're just kind of like, I have a lot of different things I could talk about. So I was trying to figure out what I was going to talk about. So I did the thing that most political scientists do, many sociologists, but not historians. I learned a lot from historians recently. Part of my difficulty is I like to talk about what I'm most excited about. Stupid move. You should talk about the book that you just published so that everyone goes to buy that book. I did not do that, so you're not going to hear about my book. I'm going to talk about my book, like for 2 seconds, The Death and Life of State Repression. That's it. I'm not going to talk about my book anymore. Now I'm going to talk about something else. I'm going to talk about the thing I'm excited about. I'm going to talk about the thing that actually, when I really sat down and think about it, TED inspired me to do like 30 years ago. So, Homeboy's legendary. I'm like, you know, I say he's a monster, but some, you know, the older folk might not get it. The younger folk will be like, damn, what's he talking about? I'm talking monster. I'm talking like, if I was to tell you the stuff that Ted did, you'd be like, sure, that's not one person. But it is one person. But part of so the academic heads are gonna get me on this one. This is like, most of the graduate students right now, they're gonna read somebody like 5 and 10 years ago, and that's gonna be the bulk of their citations. They're gonna be like, of course, knowledge accumulation, the stuff that's coming out now, or is just about to come out is the best. No, not always the case. There's some stuff that is like incredibly timeless and sits at the root of every single thing that everybody's going to do. And there's some stuff that was done better back then than it is now, and we don't talk about it because the machine just keeps rolling. And journals, including the one that Paul runs, they have limitations on how many things you could cite, right? So you have to figure out exactly what you're going to cite, what you're not going to cite, and a bunch of this older stuff gets dumped, but it's actually intricately connected with the stuff that's going on. And so the good thing about like moments like this and celebrations for TED is that we actually get to unravel some of this stuff and see some of the longer term roots, and actually where some stuff went awry and got jacked up and has just been repeated by some younger folk who aren't going back to look. And so it's like, this is like the KRS of political science for those that are into hip hop, okay? Okay, so he's one of the founding members or founding pillars of the systematic study of interstate, civil, domestic, political conflict and violence, staff member for the National Commission on the Cause and Prevention of Violence. So after MLK was assassinated, in part by the United States government, after MLK was assassinated, what did the United States government do? They commissioned an evaluation like they always do, right? They called TED to actually sit on that to provide information about what was going on in the country because people went buck wild. There was protests and so-called riots, disturbances throughout the United States, and they were trying to understand what was going on within it. And TED was brought in to help contextualize. And as Paul identified, this is something that TED thought was incredibly important to do. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but he thought it was incredibly important to get publicly involved and make social science useful for understanding what was going on in the world. He's the creator of one of the most widely listed databases in the social sciences, used the Polity series, there's several of them. He's also the creator of some of the least understood, I would argue. His Civil Strife database, his Crime in Western Societies, and Minorities at Risk. I think many people don't know exactly what's in it and are mischaracterizing exactly how it's to be used and so forth. But nevertheless, he still created it. Nevertheless, people are still using it. He was the lead researcher for Vice President Al Gore's State Failure Political Instability Task Force. To date, I think one of the best funded research projects on the planet. They receive so much freaking cash. It's just incredible. So I saw it for a minute. I was brought into it, or they tried to bring me into it. And then we ended up at some long table where half the table had like no name tags and other half of the table had name tags. And at one point, somebody slipped and someone said general something, in which case I realized who was on the other side of the table, and then I was out. But that's another point. He also popularized the topic of political conflict and violence. When Homeboy was going at it in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s and 90s, conflict and violence studies was still just growing. I mean, now, all legendary stuff aside, he still doesn't have a Google Scholar page. So those that are continuing in the trajectory of moving forward, please hook that up. Because he's got tens of thousands of citations, he is a monster, and he got no Google citation page because basically no one's hooked that up. So you can contribute to history right now by joining Wikipedia and being Ted Gurr's advocate. But Ted is a model. He's a model of what we can be as social scientists, as humanists, as peace scholars, as Americans. He establishes, I think, in many respects, a variety of different things. We can and must do good scholarship, first and foremost. Ted was always ahead with that one. We can and must collect your own data, in part because other people don't necessarily have the ideas that you do. And he was a constant innovator with regards to creating interesting data. You can and must develop your own theories. He was constantly trying to develop some new understanding of what was going on and would draw upon psychology and history and political science and sociology seamlessly to piece together his arguments about what's going on. But the biggest lessons from Ted's life, I believe, from Ted's work, think big, think differently, and tell everybody what's up. Now, we differed slightly. He was more willing to discuss with those in political and economic power what was up. I'm more of a civil society kind of person. It comes from studying state repression. I'm just like, well, governments are the people who are engaging in the most horrific activities on the planet, I would argue. And so I'm not really good at cozying up to them in any context once I realize they're present. Ted and I differed, but I learned a tremendous amount from watching him interact with these folks, because I'm just like, okay, my willing to kind of write folks off isn't exactly great all the time. And I'm ready to jump to protest way too quickly and not necessarily negotiate with those that are in power at the moment. And Ted calmed me down on that, and I think that was especially the case. And Paul is right. Why Men Rebel, in my opinion, is one of the most important social science pieces on political conflict and violence ever written. Everything that we do from that point forward, this is 1970, everything that came forward from 1970 is derivative of this piece, and there's like 3 or 4 other pieces. I'll write a blog to give you those 4 or 5, but for right now, Why Men Rebel, it's all in there. It's one of those things where it's just like, it's the gift that keeps on giving. There's so many little nuggets that are in that particular piece that helps you figure out what you should do. And I'll say it this way. Ted Gurr saved my life, or helped give me one. So I ended up in grad school, I say out of a fluke. In undergrad, I was like, oh, first I was computer science, and then I ain't like that. Then I went to macro, econ. I ain't like that. And then I was like trying to figure out what to do, and I did really well in this revolution and social change class, Cynthia Enlow, now a dear friend, but then one of those cathartic instructors like, what's the movie with Robin Williams where he's up on chairs and stuff?
Dead Poets Society.
Dead Poets. It's like a Dead Poets Society moment where Cynthia was just like, you know what? You did really well on that exam. 7 words that changed my life. Because I was like, well, damn, what am I going to do? I'm about to graduate. You did really well on that exam. I'm like, damn, I did. And then I was in. But Cynthia and also Zinovia Socher, another professor who's a specialist in the Soviet Revolution, Russian Revolution, she was like basically, hey, you know what? Human civilization is advanced most by individuals within civil society coming together to challenge those with political and economic power. I'm like, damn. I'm like, I want more of that. I'm like, so why don't they win more? She's like, you should do that in grad school. And that was me. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go to grad school for that. I don't know any professors until I get to undergrad. I don't know what any of this stuff is until I get to undergrad, basically. This is the first professors I met in my life, basically. But then I go to grad school, and I'm just kind of like, damn. I know why social movements and revolutionaries and terrorist organizations fail. There's an institution set up to kill them off. Governments. I'm like, I discovered governments in grad school. I'm like, damn, there's a whole institution. They have whole academies to do nothing other than figure out how to subjugate you all. Because youth are intricately connected with most of these movements. So you are a focal point for most social political control efforts. I'm like, damn, okay, didn't know about this. So now I'm like, now I'm all in the repression game. Back to TED. There's not much to read about state repression in 88? That old. I've been doing this for 30 years. It's my 30-year anniversary, y'all. So coming back to TED, because TED was an inspiration for me. When I'm reading Why Men Rebel, I'm like, this is like, it's not a language I know how to speak yet, but there's elements of this piece that are like, I'm like, okay, this is essential for understanding what's going on. And I'm like, literally, chapter 8, page 233, set me on a 30-year journey. You go back and read this. The ratio of dissident coercive control to regime coercive control. You'd be like, oh, what you talking about? I'm talking about protest, terrorism, and insurgency, and from the civilian social movement, civil society side, and then just put counter in front of each one. Counter protest, counter terrorism, counter insurgency for the government side. Ted was talking about this balance that existed with people from civil society engaging in all these different activities to challenge you, like Cynthia and Zenobia were getting me to think about, and then a state going after them to try to contain them. Now, Ted was interested in what that balance did, so he was interested in the magnitude of like death, the magnitude of violence. But I was like, there's something about this balance idea that I kind of want to explore. Because I'm just like, in that balance should be everything, right? I'm like, in that balance should be political stability. Maybe in that balance is economic growth. Maybe in that balance is how you feel traumatized or not feel traumatized. I didn't know how to articulate it, but there was something about that balance that made me think, it's like, okay, that's something, that's a nugget for me. And so, Paul and I were talking briefly, it's just like, when did you meet Ted? And I'm like, y'all remember the LA riots? Like, mostly no. There were some riots in a city called LA, because there's some horrific stuff, as usual, that happens, and a bunch of people just went buck wild and started burning stuff down. It's like a nice characterization of it. But the American Political Science Association did something that they rarely do, which is they were timely, and they were actually directly relevant to a particular topic. They were just like, let's have a roundtable on the LA riots. And I'm just like, yes. And they were like, let's convene some publicly oriented scholars to talk about that topic to academics. Ted was selected as one of them. The other one, two of the others were Doug McAdam, a sociologist, and Alden Morris, who's a sociologist / historian. And so I went to the panel. So y'all, I'm from Manhattan, so I'm like, I say this not to excuse my behavior, but to help explain to y'all kind of like how I approach stuff. So I'm just like, I went to Binghamton for grad school in part because they offered me money, and the deal I had from Cornell offered me a year. So it's like 5 years of support and no debt, or 1 year of support and hustle. So I went for 5 years, and so I went to Binghamton. But in my second year in Binghamton, I realized I screwed up. I realized that there's a hierarchy of educational institutions, and coming out of a low-ranked institution is not going to bode well for me in the market. So I'm like, damn, I should have gone to Cornell. Okay, knowing that, I'm like, okay, so I'm going to pick the hardest freaking committee I can think of coming out of Binghamton. Like, I want people to look at my vita and be like, damn, how the hell did he get these people? Precisely what I went for. So in acknowledging that I came from a lower-ranked institution, I'm just like, well, how am I going to get any assistance in being better? And I'm like, by meeting people like Ted Gurr. So other people, yes, I was careerist. Yes, I was incredibly ambitious. No, I was happy to hear about the LA riots and learn some stuff, but I also went there to meet Ted Gurr because I wanted some knowledge from the person that wrote Why Men Rebel. So I'm sitting in the panel, I heard everything, but the minute that thing was over, I'm just like, then I was confused. I'm just like, oh, well, Alden Morris is a brother, so maybe I should talk to him. But I'm like, he's a sociologist, so he probably can't help me that much. And I'm like, Doug he made some good points. I was like, yeah, same thing, he's a sociologist. Let me say, stay on point, Chris. So I went after Ted. So I rolled right up on him. And this next part will sound completely odd for you all that aren't used for dealing with paper. But I came there with an introductory letter, my resume, and 2 articles on paper to hand to Ted Gurr in something called an envelope to basically have him walk away with that package to then hopefully get back to me about my work. But I just meant to give him the package. Professor Gurr, I'm a huge fan of your work. I've been reading it for years. I'm very much motivated by your issue of the coercive balance. Next thing I know, he puts his leg up on a chair. You know, it's like the Marlboro Man or something. He's just like, yeah, what about it? And I'm like, damn. So I'm like, well, on page 233, he's just like, oh, you read it? And I'm like, yeah. Next thing I know, we're having a conversation for like 30 or 40 minutes. So this isn't just me. A later friend of mine, one of Ted's students that Paul was discussing that he was mentoring incredibly well, Will Moore was right behind him. Will saw Ted's seriousness of engaging with me, and so Will sat down. He's like, this is going to be a while. So Will tells me later on exactly what happened from his perspective of seeing the conversation, and then the conversation he had with Ted afterwards. He's just like, watch him. Me, I was like, so like this, you know, Will tells me this later on. I'm like, oh, choked up now thinking about it, right? I'm like, yo, that's how this works. So Ted had that looking out for new talent, keeping your eye out for people who are interested in a particular subject matter. And 2 weeks later, I get comments on my papers. 2 week detailed comments that like shift those papers, shift my intellectual agenda. But like this guy is at the pinnacle of scholarship. Has some, granted it's the LA riots, so you know, what's he think about what some black guy gonna do to him at a conversation about the LA riots? He's not really gonna diss me in that context, right? So, you know, we learn a lot from Contention. Burning some stuff helps you negotiate. But he got back to me, incredibly useful comments. And so I rolled with that. And that was very helpful. We engaged. He was very supportive over time. He continued to read my work, and it's just like to have someone of his stature engage with your work as you're just getting started, to help you navigate the particularities of journals and foundations and all of that. That was priceless, and he was much more closer to the work that I did than anybody on my committee, and so that was an amazing arrangement that we had worked out. He introduced me to people. He encouraged me. We speak of mentorship and we speak of sponsorship. The sponsorship stuff is stuff you don't see. It's stuff that people do on your behalf without you being present. And I know from other people because they were just like, oh, you know, Ted told me about you type of thing. So I know he was engaging in mentorship directly, but also sponsorship more broadly conceived. And so later when he, coming out of grad school, I was like, job. So I end up, I got a couple offers and I go to Houston. Maybe I shouldn't have gone to Houston, but I go there. And it was good in many respects because it was a job. But in other respects, I was lonely and isolated because there was no one that studied my topic. There's not many conflict and violence people in the 80s when I'm coming out anyway. And so from that perspective, job was good. Thank you. So I get to some political science meeting. And then Ted is like, hey, would you ever leave Houston? And I'm like, for what? He's just like, we're thinking about doing some stuff in Maryland, and I think you'd be good for running minorities at risk and polity, which is just like, it's like the intellectual lotto. You're like going about your business, doing some little thing, and somebody comes up with some project, and they're just like, hey, would you help run this thing? And I'm like, damn, yeah, I'm in. And so that's how I come to Maryland. So incredibly excited about it all. Now I'm finally with some other people that know something about conflict and violence. Now I'm interacting with a bunch of different folks on exactly the thing that I wanted to do. Now to be clear, I mentioned I'm from New York, right? So y'all from the 60s know that song? It's like Not Made to Follow. I'm not made to follow, so there was some tension. But my tension was in part a function of I wanted to be like Gurr. And Gurr created and crafted his way. And so minorities at risk was structured in a particular way that was, it was more aggregate. It was like nation level or group specific. And I became interested in, he's literally blowing me up. Thanks, man. Although being a conflict and violence person, you gotta be careful about that. And so I wanted to take MAR in this different direction, what I was calling micro-MAR. I wanted to look at more specific, like geographic coordinates, like look at how people were distributed across villages or across territories and take it micro. Look at more specific things. And Ted had a different orientation for his project. I'm just like, I completely respect it, right? And so I was just like, okay, you know, I need to go do my other thing. And so that's what led to my leaving the project, but also leaving Maryland to go do that. It's like, oh, what's this Rwanda and genocide? And so the other reason for leaving and kind of stepping back from all of this micro-MAR stuff was literally, I'm sure he doesn't work here any longer. And if he does, you know, I forget the guy's name. He ran like the media advice and suggestions thing. So I was doing scholarship, and again, influenced by Ted, I was just like, oh, I've been working on Rwanda for a bit, in part by a guy who's here, Ernie Wilson, who got me into this USAID project, and was like, hey, would you like to go to Africa? And I'm like, yo, I'm African American that's never been to Africa. Yeah, I'd like to go. Of course, East Africa is not West Africa, where most of us came from. So I wasn't welcomed upon arrival, but I was able to fit in because they were just like, oh, you're African American, so you don't like America either. And so I'm just like, okay, I can Malcolm for data, so I'm good. So everything was fine there, and that was incredibly lucrative. And I was doing the Rwanda stuff for a couple of years, and the 10th anniversary was coming up about Rwanda. I'm just like, hey, I have some results. I like to share it with not just Rwandans, but like the world about what's going on. And that got me identified as a genocide denier. Remember, I was from New York, so that means I had a lot of Jewish friends, which means that I was never someone who ever wanted to be called a genocide denier. It turns out my denial was a function of the following, very quick, because it got nothing to do with this talk. But you know that million figure that people toss out? It's 1,000,000 or 800,000 that people say got killed in the genocide in Rwanda. I affixed error terms to those numbers. And my lower estimate was below what the Rwandan government accepted. And so they called me a genocide trivializer. I trivialized the genocide with the lower end of my estimate. Genocide trivialization in Rwandan law is equivalent to genocide denial. And thus, if I return to Rwanda, I will be arrested and most likely tortured, because that's what Kagame does with his people. Never bring Kagame to your campus, by the way. Never, because homeboy's savvy as hell about stuff. But separate point. I digress. Let's go. So let's get to today. So I end up involved in this project called The Consequences of Contention. My co-authors, David Armstrong is a graduate from the political science program here. He was a political scientist. And Hanna Feld, a colleague from Uppsala in Sweden, and Håvard Nygaard is from Peace Research at Institute Oslo at the time. And now he's with the Norwegian equivalent of USAID, actually. We got a grant from the Research Council of Norway. There's a variety of topics that you could study in conflict and violence. Type, onset, lethality, variety, duration, termination, recurrence. There's a lot of research on all these different topics. And I was kind of part of this group that began studying consequences or outcomes or costs. And the very snooty of us talk about legacies. It's very interesting, the class dynamics of exactly who does what. But I'm a consequences person, just to be clear. And so following Ted, thinking big. I'm like, what are the political and economic consequences of political conflict and violence was the question that we went out to explore. And so most people would study some aspect of democracy, maybe suffrage, executive constraints. In economics, it's mostly GNP per capita, but there's some people that study inequality. We're studying all of them. I'm not going to talk about all of them today, but we're studying all of them, in part to be, like Ted, we're thinking big. Think big and think differently. Okay, so if you remember the course of balance, it was some dissidents or someone who's dissatisfied or wants to change some aspect of the political, economic, or social cultural system that's engaging in dissent, protest, insurgency, terrorism. And then there's a state that's countering them. That's kind of where Ted went with it. He didn't really unpack dissidents. He wasn't really looking at that many different forms of contention. And he definitely wasn't looking at that many different forms of repression. We're looking at all of them. Because the basic point we wish to argue is that relative contention represents a unification of what is generally a highly fragmented field. So there are people who can get jobs on just studying terrorism. There's people who get jobs just studying counterterrorism, mostly affiliated with the CIA or some other kind of target that are trying to get rid of people that are challenging. You can have a job by studying protest. You could have a job now for studying protest policing, which is new, yet. You can have a job studying human rights violations. Our whole point is that to understand all of these different manifestations of conflict and violence, you need to understand that there are two bodies that are going at one another, and some might be predominant. So we think of genocide. You don't really think of resistance during genocide. That's in part because resistance is incredibly low. It's not that there's no resistance, but resistance is incredibly low. But no one's rolling with genocide. Not everybody's rolling with genocide to be like, yes, we're all for it. No, there's always some resistance from civil society and that tension of trying to figure out where the balance exists. So civil war, you've heard of civil war. For those that know anything about a definition of civil war, in order to have a civil war, you need to have two parties involved in exacting victims, taking lives on both sides. And the minute both sides aren't capable of doing it, it's no longer a civil war. Revolution, we think of revolution as being people out in the streets going buck wild. Guess what? The state is weak or vulnerable and can't counter you properly. So we call that revolution. Counter-revolution is when there's some people out there trying to do something against those particular individuals. And so with this idea of thinking, always looking for this duality, always looking for this coercive balance, always looking for relative contention, all these different forms of contention are then brought together simultaneously. That's the thought. That's the big idea, that all of these things are unified. So we do rigorous work. I'm not going to talk about the Markov chain, Monte Carlo stuff, or the dynamic inequality constraints. We take a variety of data. I'll show you something in a minute that'll help clarify some of this. We take a variety of data for all forms of government coercion, and we use some latent variable modeling to figure out, is that one thing? Turns out it is. We take all data that's available on people trying to challenge some aspect of the political, economic, or social cultural system to see if it's one thing. And actually, if you think about it just for a second, we'll step off of Gurr to a contemporary of his, Charles Tilly. Tilly talks about repertoires of activities. And the repertoires are the different things that you can do. So if you're in a grieved population, you have a variety of different things that you could do. You could protest, you could petition, you could blow some stuff up. So is it appropriate to blow yourself up, or blow some stuff up? Is it appropriate to take that and study that as a separate phenomena from the petitioning and the protesting, or the insurgency part, or even lobbying? Say, no. Actually, so is there some latent concept out there about challenging political economic authorities? Yeah, there is, actually. So I'll provide a link if anybody wants it. Alperen, I just met you. Oh, sorry, man. I have to put you on the spot. Give me a country. Turkey. I didn't know you were going to say that. Come on, man. That's just messed up. Okay. All right. So what we do is, because we're not just trying to identify one side, it's all relative, right? So we have what government coercion looks like for our scale, we have what challenger coercion looks like, and then the bottom represents what this relative contention idea looks like. And so for every country of the world, we could pick the particular manifestations of government coercive behavior or challenging coercive behavior, and we can see exactly what the relative position looks like at any point in time for all the countries of the world. Now, what we're trying to do with this is understand exactly how relative contention influences diverse political and economic outcomes. So why would we expect relative contention to have an impact? I will make the bold claim here and direct you all to the book that does not yet exist, or actually the book that is not yet published. So this will be with Princeton University Press. We believe the coercive and forceful behavior of governments will more negatively impact societies than the coercive and forceful activities undertaken by challengers. You're like, man. But we hear that protesters and insurgents and terrorists are like, that's the worst thing ever. I'm like, first off, you're probably hearing that from a government. And second off, we have the idea of the social contract, right? Government's supposed to do stuff for you. There's also a psychological concept, which is institutional betrayal theory. And the minute I describe it to you, or start to describe it to you, you'll be like, yeah. Okay, so let me change context for a second. Your parent, part of their moral responsibility and legal is they're supposed to take care of you, right? So if you're like me and you love SVU, actually, come on, higher. That's it. Damn, what's up with y'all? Special Victims Unit, come on, y'all. You have to protect the weak. Parents that are taking out aggression and engaging in sexual predation and violence against their child, there's nothing that is viewed as being more sacrosanct than that. Or you have institutions that are supposed to protect you, like religious institutions or educational facilities. When you find out that individuals are being predated and in these contexts, you end up losing much more respect for the institution, but also you're more devastated psychologically than somebody that you don't really know. So the institutions that are supposed to take care of you, if they're the ones who betray you, if they betray that trust, you're more affected. You're more depressed, you're more isolated, you're less likely to kind of be outgoing, you're less likely to put in time for work, you're less likely to want to do a bunch of things. And so we use this basic idea to kind of influence our understanding of how we expect relative contention to influence you. So the argument is that as states engage in violent and coercive behavior, regardless of what the challenger is doing, that has impacts for exactly what people do politically or what they do economically. So that guiding influence is kind of like where we go with the work. And so this compels us to think a little bit differently, because now we're not just looking at the impact of terrorism on GDP, we're not looking at the impact of protest on investment within a particular city. We're looking at the relative contention, the relative position. So you're always looking for, okay, what are challengers doing? What are governments doing? And what's that relative position? It becomes jointly determined. So for the Civil War people, you're just like, Civil War is jointly determined by two actors engaging in behavior. Now we're trying to map exactly where that fits. Now we've just kind of extended the continuum to look at all government behavior that's coercive and forceful, all challenging behavior, find that joint position, and then we're just like, okay, where is that joint position and how is it affecting diverse outcomes? So I'm just going to show you a few. But we're forced to move into three-dimensional space because you could be moving along this plane. And so this is kind of like the solution that we've come up with. And this is some shape-constrained additive models. We're going to talk about scam. Whoever names these things, I'm like, who would name their statistical technique a scam? I'm like, not the brightest individual, but whatever. We'll roll with it. And so the point is that we have this multidimensional plane that we're trying to look at. And so you're trying to find out where you are in terms of one side of the scale, where you are in government, and where you are on the other side of the scale, challengers, and then you're looking at how that is influencing the particular thing that you're interested in. The economic impact here we're looking at is economic growth. We also look at electoral democracy. Let me get to the one that I wanted to, it's easier to see it this way. Okay, so We do a variety of different things in life, right? And one of the things I realize that I'm doing now is like tool development. I'm like, I think books are dead, right? And I'm just like, I've been trying to think about for a while. It's like, okay, what's the next thing after the book? This three-dimensional graph. I'm like, here's what I'm envisioning for my TED Talk, right? So like, I'm gonna be on stage, and then behind me is gonna be this three-dimensional thing, and I'm gonna push a button, and then the three-dimensional object then moves over the audience. And then what I'm doing is, I'm moving the results around so you could see the inflection points to gauge exactly that, in this context, I think we're talking about electoral democracy, is most deleteriously affected by the joint positioning of high government and high challenger behavior. But it's more influenced by government because of the nature of the inflection. So as governments engage in behavior, people are way more sensitive to government uses of coercion and force than they are to challengers, but both negatively affect you. And so I'm just like, I just imagine spinning this thing, or like Star Trek-y, right? I'm just like, I was just in the African American Museum yesterday, and I'm just like, the Afrofuturism exhibition, I'm just like, that was my favorite part, because I think they jacked up the whole thing about slavery and black people getting out of slavery because of the Civil War crap is just like completely missing W.E. Du Bois's point about it was a protest. African Americans freed themselves. They weren't freed by Lincoln or any of these folks of the Civil War. It's because they withheld their support for a system that facilitated war. That's how they got free. So the lack of agency in the exhibition pissed me off. But the Afrofuturism thing I was really excited about, because I'm just thinking about, oh, yo, I want to have my device that sits on the table, the cube comes up, and then you can identify by X, Y, Z exactly where you want to be in the figure, and then zoom into that part, and then pull up the case material about that particular case, and then be able to hyperlink to the other material that's related to it. Just to talk about the thing that's to come. And so our general proposition is played out, and you can see all the particulars on the website or the book that's coming. But I wanted to move to implications for this stuff before I'm allowed to have some questions, right? Okay. I was like, I think very TED-like. I think we're pushing the need to reconceptualize how we think about conflict, consequences, and even how to study it. We have a new measure for contention. We have effectively suggested that individuals should not study terrorism. They shouldn't study human rights violations or state repression. They shouldn't study genocide. They shouldn't study protest. They shouldn't study civil war. They shouldn't study nonviolent direct action. We hope that's dead. Now, enough people have been studying this topic that it's probably not going to be dead for a while, but that's not because it doesn't need to die. Because once you start to realize that that they're all related to one another, and in order to actually understand it, the minute you see a piece, the minute you see any piece on a single form of contention, you're going to ask yourself about, well, what's the other side doing? And does that have an influence on what it is that you're seeing? And does that response between the two condition the effects that you're trying to explore? And the answer is basically going to be yes, and we've been trying to find different ways around it. Back in the day, you were doing some kind of like dynamic modeling to try to capture it, and all kind of bizarre assumptions about instruments and so forth. Or you can identify that it's joint positioning, ignore that stuff, and move directly to some other kind of exploration. You need to consider consequences for most prominent political economic characteristics, but then move beyond that, beyond GNP. Move to inequality, move to all these other types of economic characteristics that are basically underdeveloped in many respects. You need to visit prior work. I mean, I think in many respects, we've kind of like, we're viewing the book, my co-authors wouldn't put it this way, but of course that's why I'm running the project. I'll put it this way. We are shooting weapons across the bow of every ship in political conflict and violence to question all of their results, and to suggest that everybody need to revisit everything that we think we know since this thing has been rigorously begun, which I believe is very TED-like. TED wouldn't have said it that way either, but that's all right. I'm inspired by TED, so I feel TED rising up within me, so I'm gonna make that bold claim, because TED would make that claim, and so I feel completely fine saying it, and I think the data speaks to it, which is exactly where TED would have taken you. I think we need to reconsider the implications of reorienting post-conflict and post-violence assistance, acknowledging that governments are doing the majority of the harm. I'll repeat it. We need to consider the implications of reorienting post-conflict and violence efforts and initiatives that are principally targeted around someone challenged the state and perturbed things, and now we need to go back and fix things. We need to acknowledge that states are doing the majority of the harm, and think of exactly how reconciliation and aid and reintegration of soldiers, all this stuff needs to be worked out, understanding that it's states that are the problem. And we need to examine this relative contention thing in its own right. So in writing up the consequences book, which is what the first task was for the group, I realized at a certain point that we put so much damn effort into developing a measure for contention that in order to actually explain what we're doing, we needed to have a book that just talked about the relative contention measure and to put that into the context of a history of measures that have been put forward for the different phenomena that we were exploring. So that's actually the second book, which is going to be the first. But I wrote them out of order, so we roll with what we have. I'll stop there.
Can everybody hear in this? Okay, so questions and answers, I'll walk around with the mic, raise your hand, and don't be shy. Cheryl, maybe you can just say who you are.
Oh, okay, sure. Okay, so I'm Cheryl Laird. I'm associate professor in government and politics, and I do Black politics, race, ethnicity, and politics. And I have not seen the three-dimensional graph since I was in ICPSR with Chris Orrin, and we did advanced regression. And he was like, you can make these three-dimensional graphs. And I was like, when will we use these? So you're the first application I've really seen of it. And how do you deal with questions that people might have in using that, where you're trying to grapple with multiple dimensions of a problem, and people will say, well, like, there's endogeneity. You can't tell down causal mechanisms. You can't pin down exactly what's going on. Because I like that it's a difference measure, but I do think that we think in such linearity that three-dimensional capacity is not always something that's easily accessible for understanding.
Yeah, so two parts to your question. One is kind of a sociology of knowledge kind of question, and one is the kind of standard endogeneity thing, right? So there's no real good answers for the endogeneity thing, right? So part of this project is global, and to address the endogeneity issue, another part of the project is experimental. So we're running experiments in the United States and India, subnationally, to identify exactly how our mechanisms are playing out. Once we realized that dealing with the global phenomena was complex enough and that we were summarizing so much, it was very difficult to kind of get into latent variable models, the Markov stuff, and to talk about the mechanisms. And frankly, many publishers don't give a damn about the mechanisms. That's just us. And so Princeton in particular, one of the reasons why I like them is they're just like, we're sick or tired of trying to sell books to some libraries. We're actually trying to sell some books. And so they went from selling like the beast that is Cambridge and Oxford, from selling N number of thousands of books a year to doing like 50, and they just get behind it in a way. And once I saw, like, if you saw the book, How Propaganda Works, I mean, there's no data in the book, right? But
My book was also with Princeton.
but so you know where they're going, right? But they're trying to push us narratively to kind of like assist and engage with people who might use and might be interested in our particular topics, but not have this kind of like methods-like discussion. And so I found that to be useful. But to identify that we did address it in many respects, but then we realized we needed to have a separate global and case-specific book. And then the pandemic hit, and then basically the India survey part got gutted because we did nationally representative surveys with oversamples for the different major castes. We didn't get to subcaste designations, but the 5 major castes, and then trying to then identify some regional specificity, principally in Delhi, Gujarat, and I forget the third location. And so that was moving along pretty well. But then the second survey, the first one was baseline, the second one got gutted, so we couldn't go back. So then we had all this extra money to do the US, so we did a whole bunch of experiments in the US to kind of get at these mechanisms. So we developed a political conflict and violence measure like that for the United States that was disaggregated across census tracts, which was problematic. In the Legacies of Violence project that I also have money for, I'm doing a Legacies of Racial Violence thing in the United States. We've gotten away from census tracts and cities, and we've created our own geographic zones that don't change over time. And now we're going back to kind of like put the violence measures over our new, I don't even think we have a name for the spatial designations that we've created, because census locations change and counties change over time. So we had to get rid of that to be like, okay, this specific location does not change over time. Let's identify exactly what's going on. So we are kind of like drilling down with that. The three-dimensional thing for me was very interesting because it's just like, it turns out humans are very good with one dimension. 2 dimension, we lose some folks, but we're still there. 3 dimensions, we lose a lot of people. But intuitively, I'm just like, cube. We can think in terms of cube. It's like, okay, we have 3 dimensions that we need to follow. And you're just trying to kind of like follow things as they move across the 3-dimensional space, acknowledging that things could be moving around non-linearly. But it makes you really kind of push back and be like, if these things could move non-linearly and on each of the different dimensions, then what are all these simplifying kind of assumptions that we're making with all these other models? And why are we trusting that crap? And so I like that we're kind of like pushing that, but thanks for the question. It's funny, after you got things started, he's like, oh, he's reasonable to speak with, and a whole other people kind of jump up. But the minute she said, you know, feel free to chat him up. Sister hit it. So, okay, yes.
Hi, I'm Joey Bark. I'm an undergrad in Professor Bernier's class. We're learning about survey methodology and experimentation in like the social sciences setting. You mentioned the surveys in India and the United States. How are those set up? Who do you survey? And what do you ask?
So I forget who we used, but basically we ran into problems because I don't like surveys and I don't trust experiments. New York. So I became very interested in trying to identify communities that are largely not surveyed. And so we spent a ridiculous amount of time and money because of the India failure on getting oversamples for poor people, Blacks, Latinx, Asians, different types of Latinx, right? Because I grew up in New York, so I got Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, but I'm told by Mexicans and other people from Central Latin America that those aren't Spanish people, and from Spain. So we did samples across these different communities so we could speak to these audiences, which took months. I didn't realize it was going to be that difficult, but you know, they call somebody, they hang up, they call somebody, so it took forever to do that. The survey thing for me is really interesting. Not beyond scope of what we talked about here. But when the India thing fell through and we had an influx of money and a return, because we had done the baseline sample in the United States, so we were just going back. I was like, what questions are never asked in American census material? So I asked a series of questions on stuff no one's ever asked. So it's just like, how likely are you to engage in secessionist activity? Do you know any secessionist organizations? Because I've been very dissatisfied with like the left-right continuum stuff. Because I'm like, it simplifies stuff. It's like, it doesn't say what you're willing to do to bring about change. It just asks about your connection with a pre-existing political party. But I was just like, so what you willing to do? And so we have a listing of 50 different types of activities that you can engage in, your willingness to engage in these activities, and at what, back to my 2 dimensions, and at what level of resistance from the state are you willing to engage in that behavior? So we asked a whole bunch of questions that came out that speak to, I believe, a new conception of how we could think about radicalism. And so that for me was like an incredibly useful moment, because if you think about it, many people are committed to like the time series, right? So they ask questions that have already been validated and they have a time series for. And I'm like, well, when do you get to innovation? And so you need to have the money to kind of experiment. And if you think about it, most surveys are reformist in nature. There's no revolutionary surveys. And I was just like, ka-ching. Like, let's have a revolutionary survey. What would that look like? And so a lot of our questions come from, I mean, Maoist conceptions of politics, Marxist conception of politics, subcomandante Marcos conception of politics. I'm just like, I drew liberally, because if you just restricted yourself to American discourse, then you'd never get to some of the things. Like, what's the tradition of mutual aid in the United States? Where'd that idea come from? A bunch of anarchists. Anarchists where? In Europe. So it's like, if you just had an American focus, you'd miss, I mean, most Americans don't read Kropotkin or anything like that, but, you know, we could still, there's still some people in the country that do reference him and understand it. So my survey is like, we had the stuff that we addressed, which was kind of like, okay, so we create this measure, and then we're randomly sampling geographic locations in different parts of the scale to get some understanding of how someone who lives in a high conflict and violence zone is influenced. So are you less likely to go out? Are you less likely to check in for overtime? Are you less likely to contact other people or travel? And so we have a battery of different kind of questions concerning this generally, once you've been betrayed, once the government starts to kind of engage in behavior relative to challenges stuff, that you become more reclusive and you stop engaging, you stop going to civil society. I mean, political scientists just look at like efficacy or willingness to vote, but we were just like everything. We were just like, you're not leaving your house, you're not calling other people, it's like literally a reclusiveness that you see once the state starts engaging in behavior. So that's kind of answering some of your questions. That's where we're going.
Hey, my name is John from GVPT. A big fan of your work. I just had a quick question. How does your recommendation that we need to take more seriously the negative impacts of government repression on societies jive with the idea that those protests, revolutions, terrorisms, like those organizations are the ones that become government later on?
Most of the time not. So historically, most of the time they don't, right? It's like there's no one from the civil rights movement that ran government, they participate in government. John Lewis dies, right? What's most of the conversation about? Not how much legislation he got passed, but how great he was when he was in his 20s. So this, most rebels become governing people. That stuff doesn't necessarily play out. But your general point about thinking about this, there's an interesting finding in the political violence game. It's called the Thermidor. And that's the effect that most governing entities that come from revolutionary or rebellious organizations are more repressive than the regime that they replace. So it's like, what's that tell us about reform and institutional change, right? So that means that we need to be very clear. There's something that happens between your revolutionary claims making and working out what you'd like to do if you get in office and when you actually assume office. And part of that, I think, actually goes to the book that I wrote. It suggests that we need to be very careful about monitoring the composition of the entities that are stepping in politically and acknowledging that just because the president changed, the ruling coalition, the people running the military, these people haven't shifted. So everyone was happy when Mandela became president. I always run into trouble when I do my South Africa example. We were all happy when apartheid ended. We were all happy when Mandela got elected. Many of us were not happy when he left the security apparatus intact. Many of us were not happy when there was no nationalization and land wasn't returned to people who had their stuff stolen. So if you start looking at the kind of like ruling coalition, and Mandela was just like, well, I'm not doing that because I'm not getting rid of this white guy that ran the banking industry because he knows the banking industry. And if I get rid of him, we lose all this information. And I'm kind of like, well, what's the impact of maintaining the sanctity of that particular ruling coalition? Well, that would lead to a continuity in behavior over time as the same things are being protected. So I think we need to get better at disaggregating government and seeing who's in. So like, I'll ask a question, and the minute I ask you, you'll be like, damn, good question. Who's the vice president of Rwanda? Does Rwanda have a vice president? We all know that they have a vice president, but no one knows who that person is. There's a reason for that. That's because Kagame runs the whole show. He don't want you to know who's going. He's not trying to groom somebody to replace him. So we need to get better at understanding ruling coalitions. I mean, what's this in the selectorate argument, I mean, we need to know who's part of what. We can't affix names to some of these people. So this is why I have problems with the symbolic representation stuff. It's like, okay, so some leader comes into power, and you're like, well, they look like me, I'm good. I was just talking with Hannah about this. I'm like, what are their politics? So it's probably okay to say it now, but I got into major trouble at the time. I was like, I'm not an Obama fan. It's like, yeah, but you're black. I'm like, seriously? I'm like, homeboy's from Hawaii. I have friends who went to high school and junior high school with him. He self-identified as Samoan until he got to Chicago. And he wasn't trying to disabuse Hawaiians that I am a black. He wasn't trying to roll that way. And then he went to Harvard, so we'll go to the whole class affiliation thing. So I wasn't jumping up and down about him going into office because I knew he wasn't going to necessarily represent the particular black community that I had identified. I'm like, come from Mississippi, come from Chicago, okay, maybe you have a different orientation. Come from Hawaii, go to Harvard. I'm like, I was not at all surprised. But this gets to, we need to get better about evaluating individuals and their networks and all these other things as they're moving through from challenger into office. Because we shouldn't expect certain changes with certain people coming to office and the fanfare of democratization. And this is like, you should read my book, it's great. But the big piece that comes out of that book that I'm working out now, which is not really happy, so I'm gonna say something that's not really happy. Many of us, including Ben and myself for writing the book, we're just like, okay, you know what? We know what stops state repression, you know what reduces state repression? It's democracy and democratization. And we have an explanation for it, but I have an alternative explanation that we didn't get through in the book, which is democracy might introduce a different mechanism of social political control that eliminates the necessity for having to kill you. Because hope is addictive. And this is like De La Boetie. This is the politics of obedience. This is about the best way to keep you in check is to give you hope. And if you have hope that something's going to change. My mother wouldn't talk to me for 8 years. 8 years we had, my mom lives in my house. Because she got tired of me. She got tired of me dissing Obama. She's like, give the brother a chance. I'm just like, let me get this straight. I can't talk to you about what he's not doing until he's not doing it, until he's no longer in office. I'm like, so I have to wait 8 years for you to go, yeah, you might have been right. And I'm like, I had to wait 4 years for Carter. I'm like, why are you waiting? This is an incredibly effective mechanism for maintaining social political control. And as a human rights scholar, I'm interested in trying to eliminate state coercion and force. So there's a part of me that's very happy that people are not being tortured in a large manner. People aren't being disappeared. People aren't being killed. But I'm like, this is the old power debate. This is the four faces of power that no one reads anymore, right? It's like one of the most effective mechanisms of control. It's not my taking out your kneecaps. It is you doing what I want you to do without my having to do anything. And it's like, I don't think power classes are taught anymore. I don't think anyone's really writing about the power debates, but I'm like, that for me was like very informative because Maria Stepan and Erica Chenoweth's book about nonviolent direct action and it having an amazing effect. And I brought John Lewis to the University of Michigan to talk about his graphic novel, March, because that part of his history is incredibly powerful. But they were citing Maria and Erica's piece in their talk as a measure of effectiveness and a measure of effectiveness. And I'm going, their measure of effectiveness was regime change, not poor people got more food, not poor people got land. And so I'm like, oh, symbolic representation again. And so it was just this manifestation of, I'm just like, okay, I'm very Maslow, hierarchy of needs when it comes to it. Food, clothing, housing, economic and social rights. I'm like, that's me. So I'm like, I don't care what somebody looks like as long as they can get food, clothing, housing, healthcare to folks. And how we get distracted by other stuff, I'm just like, damn, identity politics, that's some powerful crap. We're like, we stop forgetting about food. I'm just like, does this lead to that? And as a human rights scholar, I'm interested in these basic human rights. And so anyone read I think it's Carol Anderson, Eyes Off the Prize. The American Civil Rights Movement was the American Human Rights Movement, and they got gutted. They got gutted to stay away from human rights, to turn it into something that they did not intend, but that was politically viable. And so, in answer to the original question, I find that I'm like really kind of like trying to balance these things and really caught, because I'm like, wow, the thing that I personally heralded as being a solution, also directly related to TED, right? TED pointed me in the direction of political institutions and how should you measure it and how should you think about it. So I was always there. I didn't re-embed democracy and democratization back into the broader conception of power, back into the broader conception of human subjugation, and how that institutional framework could be used to keep people in check. Again, like I said, not a happy revelation, but one that seems to logically follow. Because I now finished, so my book is about repressive spells. My spell ends, which means that states are no longer killing in large manner. I'm now going back to look at those spells and see who was targeted and see what they said in the beginning and see what they said at the end. Because if pacification of claims making, pacification of objectives, a willingness to accept which is no longer acceptable, if people have shifted and been pacified over time, then we can't really be that happy at the end. Be like, yeah, the government is not torturing anybody, but is the matrix better? I'm like, if they've gotten you all to take your pills and sit there and shut up and not ask for anything, should we be jumping up and down that no one's being tortured? They don't need to torture anymore. They got you. You're done. So I'm like, that's some of the new stuff I'm working on. I'm like, I'm going back to my repressive spell data, and I'm just like, damn, how was the population affected by the repression? Which is partly the consequences discussion, is partly mental and physical health. I'm doing some stuff on mental health now with a colleague, Yara Asi. Wow, that's a long answer to the question. Sorry about that. I'll be quicker. Yeah. Ask worse questions, and then, yeah.
Hi, my name is Omar Alexander Escudero, and I'm a student in Professor Berner's class. As a Mexican Puerto Rican who has family from the Bronx, gracias, I appreciate your work in making sure that we have representation in these data sets, because we've long been a group that has been both marginalized and ignored in these. Secondly, I want to say it is a pleasure to have you here. You've given me a lot to chew on. I'm just going to leave it at that. But I was going to ask, as someone who is majoring in government and politics, and also who's someone who's involved in other research groups focusing on gun safety and conflicts in urban settings, I wanted to know what your opinion was on translating the data that you have, translating the data that you found and turning it into discourse among the people that it affects, and also maybe even public policy. Because I understand also as researchers, it doesn't end necessarily at the conclusion. It then turns into, well, what do we do about this data? How do we translate it into action, turning it into policy, turning it into discourse? How do you find what is the most effective way to do that?
Okay, you did not take my advice and ask a bad question. So, so I struggle.
What's your favorite color?
I struggle with this, right? And I think I was very much coming out of Binghamton and going to Houston, where kind of Jim Gibson and Robert Erickson were just kind of like, there's 3 places to publish, and there's 1 place to get money. And then starting to do that, I realized, I'm like, oh, okay. Chuck Tilley is the first person to kind of suggest to me that I could actually write a book. So I was just doing articles, and then Chuck was just like, that last article was kind of long, Christian. I'm like, sorry. He's like, no, if you put that paper together with this paper, you're basically 3/4 of the way to a book. And I'm like, oh, a book? Never occurred to me. So then I went to like kind of think about academic books, and then you start to realize, ain't nobody reading academic books. There's a couple of 100 people that know what the hell you're talking about, but the publishing industry pushed back, right? They're just like, we don't want these things that are 300 or 400 pages with another 100 pages of appendices, so put that online and cut that down, and then we want something that's like 200 pages, and I'm just like, wow. So I've watched, if you were watching this stuff like 20 years ago, what people would be willing to publish and what they're willing to publish now and read. So then I was kind of like, okay, so maybe it's a more trade book. And so then I'm more like, there's the colloquial me, right? I press record and start talking, and that's my voice for some of the stuff that I'm writing. But I didn't stop there, right? So the Rwanda stuff, I write like one academic article on the Rwanda stuff. Because I'm like, that's not who I wanted to talk to. I wanted to talk to US policymakers to be careful about how they were engaging. I wanted to talk to students who were about to go to Rwanda to try to work with them because they felt the need to try to compassionately assist the Rwandans without realizing that any assistance to Rwanda is helping Kagame stay in power. So, and I didn't quite catch it, but I knew enough to realize that publishing on Rwanda circulated back into Kagame-like networks because he's got a hook over the New Yorker, he's got a hook over the New York Times, and so you can't get anything on Rwanda in there unless some of those people have like changed and moved, and so that was useful. But I write comics, and I was working on a graphic novel about Rwanda because they didn't have that hook. And they didn't have that control, so I've been constantly looking at the stuff I do on Indian untouchability. We were creating a board game to explain Indian untouchability, in part because it's so alien to folks. And there's something about play, there's something about the game that assists you with kind of figuring out the parts of it and what's involved. And okay, if you're this character or this cast as opposed to that cast, this is what's going to happen to you. And so. And then this three-dimensional thing, I'm literally constantly thinking about alternative ways of communicating with folks. And I'm a big visualization fan. I think part of my issue, again, the New York thing, part of my horrible math and stat background compelled me to basically visualize what a particular plane would look like and go from there to kind of an equation. So it was always double time for me. I had to see it, and then go from there to kind of think of what that particular equation looked like that gave you that particular trajectory or so forth. But it starts for me with a picture, and then I go back. So, sorry. It's like, and so I think thinking through that a lot, and I'm kind of like, this whole kind of like what's after the book idea was literally kind of like there. I did a course on radical black thought with this political philosopher, Derek Darby, who's now at Rutgers, and we basically taped everything in class and out of class, where we basically have what we call a transcript. And so effectively this is, he's from Queens, and so we did two brothers talking about political philosophy type of thing, and we did a little bit about it on our podcast, another venue, but the transcripts are incredibly useful because it's us working through how to think about what's radical. And then from that, who is radical, but we talk about the different dimensionalities of radicalism, it's also a cube, by the way. And we're working on a program, so basically you could read Angela Davis, a book from her, and then have 40 people, let's say in a class or a conference, kind of like put her into this three-dimensional space of political, economic, and social cultural dimensions, and then compare where you sit on each dimension to the other people that are in the room, and then use that as a basis for conversation about how she is or is not becoming less political, and how her earlier stuff was far more political and far more radical with regards to what it was talking about in terms of transformation, and how the popular version of the person that calls herself Angela Davis now is not nearly where she used to be, or Du Bois, or Cornel West, or whoever, or freaking Biden. You could take anybody's speech, you could take any text and then run it through this program. And so I think I mentioned earlier that I'm into tool development, and so that's kind of like one of the things that I'm trying to pull off to address this issue. And I had, you make it sound overly argumentative. I had a discussion with somebody the other day where I was reflecting on, I think that over the past 30 years, people's capacity to write coherently is diminished. I think their ability to understand complex ideas has diminished. There's a great book called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which talks about literacy in early America. So it's like, if you could not read the Farmer's Almanac, you could die. So everyone was reading the Farmer's Almanac because you had to. There's really nothing that's essential now, but the book kind of goes from the Farmer's Almanac sense of literacy up into the age of television. Once television becomes the predominant way of communicating with people, literacy is somewhat diminished. No one's sitting through a 4 to 5 hour presidential speech from Lincoln, 4 to 5 hours, 10 to 15,000 people sat for 4 to 5 hours. It's like Cubans listening to Castro go on for like 9 or 10 hours. Folks don't have that kind of patience anymore, nor can they mentally put together these ideas about what's being talked about. It's even worse now, because now you're supposed to articulate an understanding of monopoly capitalism in 140 characters. Who's doing that? You can't do that. That's a long ass series. Excuse me. That's a long series of, it's like, oh, it's the 150th series of discussions of monopoly capitalism on Twitter. I mean, like, who's going to do that? Nobody. And good luck TikToking that, right? It's like Metsamoros or somebody that's talking Beyond Capital. That's like the new book that I'm trying to like work through now. Because like the capitalism that Marx was talking about was like the early capitalism. He wasn't talking about like monopoly capitalism. So Metsamoros did what Marx did back then. It's like 900 pages. Who's reading that? It's like, I'm like, and it's hard copy too. I'm like, who could afford the book? Who was reading the book? And so we're all at a disadvantage trying to figure these things out. And I think we're literally trying to figure out what form to use as we're communicating ideas. I don't think I've done an essay for a class for like 4 or 5 years. But one of my students showed me this. I did a class on Jim Scott. We did 5 books, undergrad and grad. We read 5 books completely, not chapters. Because I'm like, how do you write a book if you can't read a book? So whatever. And so we got to the end, and then I'm like, okay, you know what? You have this material. The challenge for you as the students is to figure out how best to communicate this material to someone who did not sit through this class. And one of my students came up with a series of 10 TikToks to explain Jim Scott. It's better than any essay I've read in like 20 years. And I was like, all right, okay. At that level, I'm good. But I knew she knew the concept because we worked through it for a whole semester. But her reflection of how she could best communicate with her people and the things that she didn't, and I showed it to Jim, and he was like, damn. So I think this idea of like venue and format, it's very interactive. But I also, students in Michigan, it was worse at Notre Dame. Students at Notre Dame aren't the most creative, I'll say. They were a little bit rigid. And so I come in with my like, we're gonna co-evolve with, very, very Reggio Emilia, right? It was like, we're gonna co-evolve with regards to defining. There's like, what's the rubric? I'm like, there ain't no rubric. And I'm like going, Eric Fromm, Escape from Freedom. And they were like, who? And I'm like, oh, here we go. I'm like, who's read Eric Fromm? Damn, look at this. Okay, the basic principle of Escape from Freedom is democracy is difficult. There's deliberation, there's listening, there's talking. It takes a while. It takes a lot. Authoritarianism and totalitarianism, much easier. Just have people tell you what to do. But if all you're taught is this totalitarian way of kind of communicating and interacting, all you're good at is then following. So then if someone presents you with true freedom, you don't really know what to do with it, and so you rebel against it, and you have problems with it. And so, that's why my teaching evaluations are completely bifurcated. He's the best ever. He's the worst ever. Because I'm just like, Eric Fromm. And they're like, damn, again with that? I'm just like, where's the rubric? I'm like, there is no rubric. Where are the slides? There are no slides. Those of you on both ends of it, the students, you should be able to listen to somebody and understand exactly what is or is not important from what they're talking to you about. On the fly, not by having stuff underlined. You should be able to listen and be like, okay, that was important. And the professors, I think we're doing people a disservice by giving them some slides. We'd be like, you don't really need to pay attention while we're having this interaction in real time, because you could take this thing home with you and then get it then. And I'm like, I don't know about you, but in New York, we call this slipping. When you out someplace and you like forget something, so I love living in Ann Arbor because I can slip all the time. Oops, I left my phone in the cafe. Guess what? Next day, I go back, it's still on the table. That's not New York. So I feel like I've lost some of my New York sense because now I'm slipping in different ways all the time that New York would make me pay for, but that Ann Arbor is like forgiving me for. So I'm just like, that's one of the reasons why you live in a place like that, so you can slip a little bit and not have to be constantly on it, because I didn't realize exactly what New York had done to me until I left it. And then this gets back to the legacies, consequences thing. I'm just like, what impact did living in New York in the 70s and 80s have on me? What impact did my perception of the treatment of Amadou Diallo or the folks that got beat down in Bensonhurst, what impact did witnessing that racial violence, because those were my people. I'm like, and why could I never go to Harvard or Tufts or any place in Boston? It's because I grew up when Roxbury was on fire. There's more yellow buses that were pushed over and set on fire in that location than almost any location in the South. And I'm like, these might not be the same people that are living there now that were living there then, but I'm like, I see Boston, that's what I think of. I don't know about you, like, I go to a new city, I get on public transportation, I get off, and then walk around. Southie got me out of that. I went to South Boston, I got off, and I'm walking around, I'm like, oh, what a nice quaint neighborhood. And 7 gentlemen escorted me back to the train at a rapid pace, with me running to get out of the city, or that part of the neighborhood. Fantastic. Again, sorry about that, damn.
It's not a problem. Hello, my name is Mason Minus. I'm a sophomore government and politics major. Also, Professor Bernier is my teacher for government politics 201, professor. And so today I really took a lot away from the equation in terms of all of the different things that you can do. Me personally, I want to be a leader. I want to invest in the government and try my best to create change, knowing that I'm still a black man in this world. And so my question is, how can I be a person who has a fresh voice to the legislation and to the government in a way that my voice does not become stale, learning the concepts, learning what I need to know, and also promoting new ways of thinking so that we can just continue to progress as a culture and as a society?
Damn. What classes are you teaching? Students are rolling. Fantastic question, man. And I'm like, as a sophomore, I can't even imagine I would have been able to articulate that. So it's great. It's beautiful to see progression. I'll start with saying, be incredibly guarded and skeptical regarding exactly what could be accomplished through government, especially on its own. So I mentioned John Lewis, I'll mention AOC, right? There's a truth and power to what they say and what they do, but they're incredibly inefficacious within government because of the people they're interacting with. So you could be as genuine as you want to be in that particular context, but you have a bunch of other people you need to convince of a whole bunch of other things. So related to that, you need to understand exactly who these other people are and exactly who they're representing and exactly how that limits them. So I'm like, there's not nearly enough stuff done on lobbying, in my opinion. And I'm just like, okay, you might be voted on every 4 years, but you have someone handing you legislation like every week. You have lunch that you're having with these folks. And that's what DC taught me. I'm just like, I didn't realize that these folks were right across the street. I didn't realize that these folks had the kind of pull that they did. And so there's that. So the polling and understanding of exactly who these other people are and what's running them. And I think money in politics is completely coercive. Related to that, fresh voice. Fresh voice is communicating with the majority of the people in the United States and the world that are not in these halls and that are not in government. I mean, the amount of survey work that's done on people that are below the poverty line is incredibly poor. We don't know we don't know. Now, I'm not of the kind where it's like there's a whole bunch of foundations who are just like the community will lead you. I'm like, these folks are traumatized. How are we going to get responses from them? They know how to navigate and survive this thing, but understand it and resolve it, they're not even close to that. But it's necessary to understand their perceptions of what they're viewing as being most problematic, but it doesn't stop there. So what you get from the social movement efficacy literature is social movements are great about getting things on agendas. They're horrible about the specifics of legislation. They're horrible about implementation. And they're horrible about getting things actually changed that prompted them to engage in activity in the first place. So you need movements to get attention, but in order to get things done well in terms of legislation, you need your constituencies in office to assist you, but then the movement can't go away because the movement helps keep everybody on track. It's like, okay, the minute you mess up, you're out, or we're going to take you out, or we're going to arrest you, or we're going to find some way to indict you. And so that degree of accountability, and that's going to be difficult, right? That means you need to convince people that their civic participation doesn't stop after the person is elected in, but that they're consistently on point with regards to guaranteeing accountability. And that's a very different way of viewing politics in general, and definitely American politics, because they like want to pull people out. And so if you maintain this idea of the community, your peers, and then reaching out, I'm like, there's so many lessons to learn about how to navigate politics and economics from the globe. And this is why I'm listed in world politics, comparative and American. You come to realize it's just like why would we try to narrow ourselves in terms of understanding the problems and resolving the problems by just looking in one territorial unit, which is arbitrarily allocated, artificially maintained, and purposely trying to keep us separate from other folks around the globe that could resolve our problems. You maintain that kind of orientation, and I think that just starts to open things up. And it's fascinating to read things about now. It's just like King was looking to India, but other parts of the third world. Thurgood Marshall was on a global tour, but also Thurgood Marshall, before he died, it's funny. It's like I think it's in Time magazine or Newsweek. He's like, yeah, we might have messed up with our legal political approach. And I'm like, that was his approach. so homeboy said, there's something else we should have done. When I read the Eyes Off the Prize, I'm just like, what you mean human rights movement? Because we're told civil rights movement. What do we know about human rights law? What do we know about Yusef Naim Clyde, the antisocial contract, and someone that Malcolm selected for the Organization of African American Unity because he knew about international law? There's just a whole swath of folks and perceptions and answers that we've not looked towards to fix the different problems that we're addressing. And you maintain that openness, that'll do it. But you send me an email, man. I'll send you a list of folks to, like, if I had read it my sophomore year, I would have been dramatically transformed by it, because I think that's a beautiful question.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have to give our speaker a little bit of a break before his afternoon meeting, so let's give him a